Hi, everybody. Welcome to 5550, our module on teamwork, which is the thing I'm most excited about. So I've spent the last 10, 12 years studying teamwork, specifically in higher education contexts and specifically in technical communication classrooms. And so this is a topic that I'm really excited about, that's near and dear to my heart. But also, I think will be very practical and helpful for y'all as you work through teaching teams and teamwork. So before we jump right in, I want to give a plug to this resource. A lot of the content from these slides come from this resource, Team Writing, a guide to working in groups. It's a really short book written by Joanna Wolf. Awesome resource. And I'm super excited to also announce that I'll be writing the second edition with Joanna. So Team Writing second edition, I will be a co-author on. And I'm going to be integrating some information about artificial intelligence and information about data-driven decision-making, some other work that I've done over the years. So again, great resource and a topic that is extremely near and dear to my heart. So I'm going to try to, make this as concise as possible, just for your own attention spans. But if I end up either going too long-winded, please feel free to skip ahead if it's not helpful, or if I did not give enough detail about something or another, please feel free to email me with any questions. So this question, I like to ask my students at the very beginning of class. And teamwork research has been around for a bit, but not nearly as long as you would think, especially in the higher education contexts. And one of the sort of universal findings of team research in higher education contexts is that it's almost universal that students have a negative perception of teams, right? So if you ask a student, do you like working on teams? The answer is almost always no. And quite a bit of research has been dedicated to kind of figuring out, why do students hate teams? How can we make them better? Can we make them more effective? And we'll talk about some of the answers to some of those questions here in a bit. But before we move on to the next slide, I want you to just think about your own teamwork experiences and think about either positive or negative, what made them positive and what made them negative, and sort of keep that in the back of your mind as we continue through these slides. So teamwork is going to be essential and almost ubiquitous in technical communication. And in particular, in higher education contexts, right? So any technical communication classroom in higher ed is certainly going to have teamwork. And then almost certainly any sort of professional workplace situation, you're going to be working on teams, right? So complex documentation, things that are 100, 200, 300 pages, require content management, require content strategy, those are going to be run through a team. That's not going to be the responsibility of one sole individual. And in technical communication in particular, technical communicators find themselves on all kinds of diverse work teams, and oftentimes on teams of developers, on teams of subject matter experts, scientists, engineers, things like that. And oftentimes those are going to be people that are not in the same country, not in the same state, not in the same time zone. And so there's all kinds of considerations for teamwork that students should know and should be at least introduced to as we're introducing them to teamwork. Teamwork is particularly challenging amongst college students. And then the reason why I say it's particularly challenging amongst college students is that in higher ed, teams are specifically unique to teams in the workplace, right? So in higher education, in college classrooms, teams are fundamentally different because they lack hierarchy, right? Not in the sort of negative sense of the term, but there is no sort of reporting structure. So it's a completely flat hierarchy. So even if we're appointing a team leader or a team leader emerges, oftentimes that team leader can't actually lead because there's really just no reporting structure in college classrooms, and that's not a judgment statement. That's not a good or bad thing. That's just a challenge that we have to address as instructors. Teamwork oftentimes fails because students aren't equipped and instructors aren't equipped to teach teams. And teams succeed when there's trust, and this is all sort of well documented in the literature. But when there's trust, when there's cooperation, and then more importantly, when there's logistical sort of structures set up for a team to succeed. And so we'll talk about some of those structures here in a bit as well. So as you're thinking about, or as you're starting to introduce a team project to students, there's sort of some guidelines, some best practices that we recommend that we found to be effective for our students. So the first would be to appoint a team leader, and team leaders typically team leaders will present themselves to you, meaning we don't start teamwork until about halfway through the semester, so you should know your students fairly well by then. And team leaders, you can kind of look for specific characteristics of a good team leader. So things to not look for. So oftentimes it can be tempting to try to find sort of the most enthusiastic, loudest person who wants to talk the most and sort of control conversations, and these could all be positive characteristics, but may not manifest as an effective team leader. Instead, what I look for when I'm appointing a team leader is someone who clearly is organized, obviously has turned in assignments on time, but also just looking for someone who can facilitate or organize or coordinate activities of a group of people. That person is not necessarily the person who's the loudest person in the room. So those are some characteristics that I look for. We want to obviously have a clear and definitive goal. We want to divide our tasks. This is one thing that you kind of want to watch out for, because oftentimes what happens in team projects is an instructor will assign a 10-page paper, for example. They'll divide students into teams of 4, and the students will literally just say, each of us have 2.5 pages to write. Right. And what ends up happening is you've got a report that's sort of Frankensteined together that sounds and reads like it's been written by 4 different people. And that's really not the most effective use of teamwork. Instead, it's really more important to think about sort of how each task depends on other tasks, and to think about how specific students have specific talents and skill sets that will help them naturally gravitate to a particular task. So when I'm dividing tasks, or when I'm having students divide tasks, I'm encouraging them to think about their own skill sets and their own strengths. So instead of just saying, I'll do 2.5 pages, if someone is maybe stronger in visual design, you have that person really focus on creating a template for the report. If you have someone stronger on content development, well, that person can outline the report. Someone stronger on editing, that person can revise and nuance the report. Right. So dividing the tasks based on skill set instead of just based on sheer equity or volume of words written, because we know the number of words written doesn't necessarily indicate the amount of work that was put into a project. The last couple bullets, I won't go through bullet by bullet, but these all sort of allude to this idea of like organization and logistics, right? So it's best and very important for students on the front end before a project starts to make decisions about how are we going to communicate? How are we going to meet? How often are we going to meet? What kinds of technology will we use? How will we do revisions? How will we make sure we don't revert changes from one version to the next? How do we manage version control? All of that kind of stuff is sort of logistical planning that's extremely important for students to do before the project starts. And we'll talk about the team charter, which is a tool that really helps students sort of put these things down on paper. Face-to-face meetings. I typically, if I'm teaching TECM 2700 in person, I am requiring my students to have at least one face-to-face meeting a week for their team. And I'll even let them have the first 10 minutes of class once a week. So if I'm teaching Tuesday, Thursday, for example, I'll give them 10 minutes on a Tuesday to coordinate the week's activities. But the things that I'm asking students to do is make sure you have an agenda, most important. And then make sure you have someone documenting changes and documenting action items. And so those are, one of the things that I like to do when I'm teaching teamwork is to actually have a full class period on face-to-face meetings and sort of how to run a meeting effectively. Team conflicts. Every semester I've ever taught teams, there's been a conflict in some way, shape, or form. And these typically manifest in several different ways. Interpersonal differences, gender differences, cultural differences. All of those things can lead to conflict on teams. But sort of what undergirds the conflict often, and this is in the literature, this has been researched, what undergirds or is foundational to these three types of conflict is really going to be inequitable distribution of work, right? So even in things like gender differences, people can experience things like microaggressions or even just full-blown aggressive behavior, and that can happen, and that's terrible. But more often what I see happen, and this is actually very well documented by Joanna Wolf and some other scholars, is that male students tend to take the bulk of the sort of front-facing work, the work that gets seen by the end user, and female students tend to get assigned to work that is sort of in the background. So this is things like make sure you edit it and make sure it's edited well, or make the PowerPoint slides look pretty, for example, right? Those are the kinds of things. And this is not me just saying this. This is all well documented and researched by Joanna Wolf in 2006. And so these differences are often undergirded in inequitable distribution of work. So how do we manage that? Well, we want to obviously make sure that everybody feels safe on the team, and safe to be heard, and their opinions to be heard. We want to encourage, obviously, team members to take everyone's opinions seriously, and to constructively discuss sort of any disagreements. I always tell students, and this is just a good sort of practice in life as well, is there are going to be more things you agree on than you disagree on more often than not. And so try to find the things that you agree on before focusing on the things that you disagree on. What I like to do too when there's a stalemate is just to take a vote, right? So if you've got a team of 4, 3 out of the 4 agree to it, you take a vote, and everyone, once the vote is made, everybody on the team just is okay with it and will support it fully. The worst thing that can happen on a team is to have a team member sort of silently assent to something, a decision that a team makes, and then sort of hold a grudge. And that can manifest in a lot of terrible things happening, students sabotaging one another, etc. So it's important to have a sort of on the front end to encourage a clear lines of communication across team members. And then, of course, as an instructor, there may be times you need to intervene. Okay, so let's shift gears here. We're at 14 minutes. I am going to promise you to get this done in 20 minutes. So a charter improves. So let's talk about team charter. A team charter is like basically a contract for the team. It's a written document that the teammates all agree to. So this creates discussion amongst teammates. It creates expectations, clear expectations. It helps stop problems before they start because you've got sort of conflict resolution built into the charter itself. Provides reference point for teams, right? So if conflict arises, then you can refer back to the charter and say, well, we agreed to X, Y, and Z. And it provides references for the instructor, right? So not all teams are going to be the same. And so if one team has decided to handle things one way and another team another way, at least the instructor is kept in the loop about what the protocols and systems are for that particular team. So here's the document. This is a template that I put together, and this template actually will go in the second edition of Team Writing, that book by Joanna Wolf that I mentioned at the beginning. And you can see the parts that are circled in red. So we've got goals. We want this is again to establish shared expectations. We got personal goals, right? So one person may want to really get good at design. One person may want to get a really nice portfolio piece. One person might want to write articles and have that as a portfolio piece. So each individual might have a different personal goal. One person might want to build their leadership skills and want to take a chance at being a leader. So we'll list those out, potential obstacles. And you'll see this table here. We don't want students to just list out obstacles like it'll be hard to meet, or oops, everybody's schedule is different, for example. Those are obstacles. But we also have this column for response. So what are we going to do about that? Well, we're gonna try to do face-to-face meetings once a week, and then supplement that with a Zoom meeting for folks that can't make the face-to-face meeting, right? So to have proactively solutions to our problems. Conflict resolution. So we want a 1 to 2 sentence protocol for resolving conflict. Basically, just when conflict arises, we'll have a discussion. If that escalates, we'll have a vote. If that escalates, we'll leave it up to the instructor. That's going to be different from team to team, but that's sort of how it works. And then missed deadlines, right? So if an individual on your team misses deadline by a day, 2 days, or 3 days, what are we going to do? Again, and that's up to the team to decide and have shared expectations around. I talked about this a little bit in a previous slide, but what are the responsibilities of a team leader? So we talked about qualities already, right? Someone who's organized, someone who facilitates, someone who can coordinate multiple people. But what are the actual responsibilities? So they're the primary contact for team members. So if a team member doesn't know what he or she or they should be doing, then the team leader is the person that says, okay, well, you need to do X, Y, and Z this week. They're also sort of the liaison between the team and the instructor. So I typically try to meet with all of my team leaders once a week. I'll use 10 minutes of class and just have a quick check-in with them. They help finalize decisions, delegate responsibilities, and most importantly, leads by example and with diplomacy, right? So again, we don't want necessarily the loudest person in the room or the person with the strongest opinions, but we want someone who can coordinate, who can be diplomatic, who can be well liked by their team members. Okay, the next section of the charter is something that I came up with, and this is, I wrote a research article on this in 2013. And this is what I think is the most important part of the charter, which is the communication plan. Okay, so basically what we see in this left column is different contexts for communication, right? So one-to-one, one member to another, group to the group, simple messages, right? So send me your edits, for example, versus complex messages, which is the third paragraph needs more research. Let's discuss. That's a complex message. File sharing. So how are we going to share our work with one another? And then actual synchronous collaboration, right? So how do we co-author? How do we have group discussions that are not face-to-face? So that's this left column. And then these three columns are sort of the urgency of the situation. right? So for really urgent one-on-one communications, we want to, and in these boxes, we're going to put a specific communication medium, right? So for example, if it's urgent and it's an individual communication, if it were my team, I would say text message followed by a phone call, right? If it's medium importance, I might say Microsoft Teams message followed by a text message. If it's low importance, I might say, a Microsoft Teams message or an email, right? So we're really thinking about communication mediums, so that everybody's on the same page, right? Because what often happens on Teams is I reached out to you via email. Well, I don't check my email that often, so I missed it, right? So by having this plan, that kind of situation or context can't happen, or is much less likely to happen. So you would go through each of these, and each of these cells is going to have its own communication medium. It can certainly there can certainly be overlap, right? So you may use text messaging for more than one of these cells. You may use phone call for more than one of these cells, and that's okay. And then finally, there's the team roles section. Okay, so there's two ways to think of roles. Okay, and in the charter, I want you to think about this first way to think about roles. Okay, so the first way to think about roles is, how am I a good teammate? What role do I play on the team? Right, so less about my skill set, less about like I'm the quarterback or I'm the running back or I'm the designer or I'm the developer or I'm the editor. So not sort of take subject matter out of your mind and think about this first idea of what are my strengths in participating on a team itself, right? So one team role is going to be team leader. Another team role might be documentation specialist, or someone who is the secretary, right? Who's taking notes for and making sure those notes are accurate for the team. Another person might be the person responsible for turning in all of the work, right? Quality assurance. So that person might be the last line of point of contact for revising and reviewing all of the work before it gets turned in, right? So these things don't rely necessarily on subject matter expertise, but rather on what are my strengths in operating on a team. So you'll put the team member's name, what the role will be, and how their strengths are related to that particular role. Last thing, instructor gets the final say. So things will go off the rails. Typically, it's not every team. It's usually one team or two teams in a class where there's maybe some dysfunction. You get the final say as an instructor, right? So sometimes you may need to intervene. There's times where I've had to split teams. There's times where I've had to just make it an individual project for teammates. That's fine. If that's the situation that it's where it is, if that can stop situations that could get particularly toxic or challenging, you may need to intervene. I also may decide a team's recommendations are inadequate, right? So a team may say, I want to kick this person out because they missed, two deadlines. I might say that's not enough to kick someone out of your group. And so it might be the instructor's job to then also override maybe a team's recommendation, but then also help them make a plan for moving forward. So I always tell my students that I'm the last resort, right? So I want them to work out conflict as much as possible. But it's also important as an instructor to just keep an eye out, because oftentimes students don't by default communicate to the instructor when major conflict is happening. Oftentimes what happens is a week or two before the final project is due, a student will come up and say, this terrible conflict has been happening all semester. What do I do? And at that point, it's maybe a little bit too late. So as instructors, it's important to just to keep your spidey sense alive, right? To kind of observe and watch and see which groups might be struggling, and maybe intervene before before it gets too far off the rails. So that's teamwork. I mean, I've studied it for 12 years, and I've given you 24 minutes. So obviously, we've not covered everything, but I hope that this is a good start and that this is helpful. And as always, please email me with any questions.